I was walking past a newspaper stand, and I don't normally pay attention to newspapers. They don't interest me. They tend to be very mainstream. But I walked past one, and something caught my eye immediately. I saw an article on the title of the newspaper, of a mainstream newspaper, talking about domestic violence and domestic abuse towards men. Now, first I thought, I have to get my eyes checked here. This is just not possible. German newspaper, by the way. This has to be a local rag or something that happened locally, some incident. No, I looked again, and it was Die Welt am Sonntag. Now, Die Welt am Sonntag is Die Welt is a major newspaper, and it was Die Welt am Sonntag Kompakt, which is sort of the compact, abbreviated edition, but it still was Die Welt. And I said, you know what? I've got to waste €2.70 on this just to see what it's written about, what they're talking about. And it's on the title. There's a picture. And the title goes like this. Hit twice, almost 30% of all victims of domestic abuse or domestic violence are men. However, oftentimes not even the police believe them. The story of an impossible condition or state of affairs, I'm adding that in there. Now, that's pretty impressive. And I'll be posting a link to, I guess, a picture of the article. This was a sort of actual newspaper as opposed to a internet article. So I read through it, and it was pretty solid. They cited research from American studies, Canadian studies, British studies, as well as German studies, and they were pretty fair and judicious in how they talked about things. And I was shocked. I mean, let's face it, the vast, vast majority of newspapers would never talk about domestic abuse towards men. I was talking to Coltrane briefly about this. You would never see this in an Australian newspaper. You would never see this in an American newspaper. You would never see this in a British newspaper. But here you have a mainstream newspaper, an abbreviated version, albeit, Die Welt am Sonntag, and they're actually talking about a phenomenon that is pretty common. In fact, they cite statistics that show that women, in many cases, will perpetuate and initiate violence more often than men. I mean, a lot of this is known to people who follow this, and I'm hardly an expert on domestic violence stats, but what they said seems to add up to what I've read and what I understand and what people have been talking about for years who are more directly involved in this sort of stuff, MRAs, anti-feminists. So this in itself is pretty remarkable. German newspaper, mainstream newspaper actually talking about this. But there are 2 points I want to make here, or maybe 3, depending on how you view it. Number one, you wouldn't see this in an Anglo-Saxon newspaper. It just wouldn't happen. And the reason for this is, I think, ultimately cultural. There's something about German culture that is in fact differentiated from American culture, Australian, or is basically Anglophile or Anglo-Saxon culture, which is to say there's a kind of reflectedness in the German sort of intellectual consciousness, I think, that isn't present in the United States. I'm not saying Americans are dumb, and a lot of people ask me, why do you want to live in Europe and not in the United States? This is one of the reasons. There's certain issues in Germany that are just, like the Holocaust religion. That's meh. That is a kind of a non-starter. But when it comes to this, they say, well, look, we have these data, and what do the data tell us? And wow, this actually occurs, and there are examples, and here are experts telling us that it's true, and they're not in a state of denial. Nobody is coming out, to my knowledge, and saying, no, that's not all true. And the woman who wrote this was a woman. Yeah, a woman wrote the article reporting on it. So I think it's partially a cultural thing. You just wouldn't see this outside of continental Europe, specifically in Germany. And I can't really speak as well for other countries, but I suspect you might see something along these lines in the Netherlands as well. Places that are just not so skewed and tilted as the United States, and just kind of have a more reflective culture. But that's a kind of minor issue. I do have a criticism of the article, and my criticism is a pretty simple one. It's one I exercise frequently. And that criticism is the way it's framed, not the data that are cited, not the information. It's well written, and it's neutral and fair, I think. It's just that the people they interview, talking about this as a structural or societal problem. Yes, this is a structural societal problem, domestic violence against men. It's pretty common, a lot more common than people think, but it doesn't get to the heart of the matter. They talk extensively about the need for men to at least present a sort of macho masculine appearance. And one of the reasons why this goes on for years and years in many cases, women throwing objects at them, abusing them. One instance in the article cited the woman pushed the guy out the window, is, that they don't want to show weakness. And there's a woman who's interviewed saying this is a structural problem and this is all about societal pressures and blah, blah, blah. But here's the problem. The problem, as always, is biology. There will always be a problem with men suffering domestic abuse and an unwillingness to report it. And the reason is simple. The model for society is a biological one. Women do not respond well to men who are weak and quote-unquote effeminate. Men who cry, men who show their weakness, who show their vulnerability. I mean, that's one of the biggest lies pitched out there. He needs to show his vulnerable side. No, that's a bunch of bullshit. It doesn't turn women on. They might say that, but viscerally, biologically, they don't react to that too well. So, what am I saying here? The elusive Karen Strawn once said, "Men are what women want them to be." Now, you can unpack this statement at two levels. At the proximate level, men are absolutely what women want them to be. If there's some trend saying, we want men to dress up in bunny costumes and pop around 2.5 times and then do a handstand, that's what men are going to do, by and large. Not all of them, but many of them. But in a distal, ultimate sense, men evolved to be what women wanted them to be. And because the consensus at a physiological level, psychological level, is not that women want men who show their weakness and their vulnerability, you're never going to have men who are forthcoming about this. About experiencing violence and verbal abuse and all these things in relationships. Some will if it gets to the point where it's unbearable or intolerable, and they talk about that in the article a bit. But at the end of the day, that's not a desirable trait for men to have with regards to women. So it's just not a problem you can really solve, I think. And it's not very helpful to talk about it as a structural problem or a societal problem. Of course, it is a structural problem. It's a societal problem. But what is society but the body of our biology writ large, the effect of what we evolved as and how we evolved? So I think it's really important and a kind of a step forward in some sense that of all things, Die Welt am Sonntag, compact but still, Die Welt, a major German newspaper, is reporting this and talking about this. But, it's still something that I don't think can ever really be fixed or resolved, because if men behaved this way en masse, believe me, it wouldn't be too soon and women would complain about how men are pussies and sissies. That's just not the way men are hardwired. They evolved a certain way. So is there an ultimate resolution to this? No. However, if articles such as the one published in the newspaper took a more biologically rooted approach to explain this, for example, the reason why men appear macho, blah, 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 is because of biological necessity. It's how they evolved. Women respond well to this. It would be much more helpful than talking about things like sort of cultural conditioning and social pressure and what have you. Of course, there's social pressure. At the same time as not having women responding particularly well to this kind of behavioral phenotype, if you wish to refer to it as such, you're going to have men in the dominance hierarchy taking pot shots at these guys because they're going to increase their value in status in the dominance hierarchy and then lower other men's status at the same time. Oh man, this guy couldn't keep his woman in line. Look, he got hit, he got beaten up. So whether it's intrasexual competition between men or pleasing women and basically being reproductively viable, there's just no way out of this. Men who are in these situations don't really have many options. I suspect even if there were dozens of so-called, men houses, just like there are women's houses or refuges or whatever, what have you, most men wouldn't take advantage of it. I mean, as I said in the title, the police often don't believe these people. So, yeah, there's a culture of disbelief and a culture of disapproval, but all of that really comes from innate biology, and I don't see a solution to it immediately. But just because there's no immediate solution doesn't mean we shouldn't actually address the topic and we shouldn't address the facts and the biological roots of this stuff. Until we do that, we're going to be lost. So, my props to Die Welt am Sonntag, but it's not good enough. It's great that a mainstream German newspaper actually has an article about this, citing real stats, talking about real incidents, but the canard, as I would like to call it, of just sort of cultural pressure and cultural influence and blah, 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 it's just not enough. It doesn't have enough explanatory power, and thus that is my criticism. However, it is, as I said, a step forward, and, God's forbid one day if Anglophone countries could have a newspaper, a mainstream newspaper like the New York Times or the LA Times, producing something along these lines, but I just don't see that happening anytime soon. So, yeah, those are my talking points on this. And I thought it was important to bring this to your attention because this is kind of, in some sense, groundbreaking. Mainstream newspaper talks about domestic violence towards men. I mean, wow, that's pretty major. Everyone, thanks for tuning in, and I will check you out later. Have a good remainder of your weekend. Bye-bye. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.